Now, I always say there is a delicate balance between intention and surrender. Intention is just getting clear on what we want, as we said. Surrender is allowing us to experience the emotion of what it would feel like ahead of the actual event. And when we surrender to that emotion without trying to figure out how the event is going to happen or when it's going to happen, this is when we're trusting in an outcome, we're trusting in the unseen, and we're not using our senses to determine reality. In other words, we're not analyzing, we're not fretting, we're not trying to figure out, we're not using our thinking brain, our analytical mind to get in the way of the outcome of that destiny. So, the male brain is highly wired for intention. Men are single-minded, they're hunters, they're activity-driven. When they get a vision or an idea, immediately they get their behavior to match their intention, and because of their single-mindedness, their brain is wired for intention. Now, the female brain is wired for surrender. That because women in antiquity took care of the young and the old, that they were caregivers in a sense, and they took care of the community. Whenever they had to make a decision about something, they always considered the whole in making the decision. So in their mind, they would review every potential experience and then allow themselves to feel what it would feel like in every one of those experiences. And then they would pick an experience that produced an elevated emotion that would allow the protection or the survival of the clan or the community. And so women can very easily resonate with future potentials emotionally because that's what they were genetically driven to do. Now, the balance is two halves making a whole. We need intention to get clear on what we want, and then we have to surrender to that destiny and energetically live in the state of mind as if it has already happened, and we allow ourselves to unfold into this mind, and this is when new and unusual events begin to happen. Now, living by that analytical mind, driven by some of the lower emotions that we've talked about, anger and frustration and aggression and depression and sadness and insecurity and fear, those limited emotions, when we're living from those lower vibratory emotional states, we're always trying to control the outcome of how the event is going to happen, because the chemicals of stress or the chemicals of survival are very, very strong chemicals that endorse the ego to become very selfish, to become very self-involved, very self-centered, very self-indulgent. All the focus is on the self because those survival chemicals cause us to focus on three things: the body, the environment, and time. When an organism in nature is threatened in its environment, it's always concerned about taking care of its body. It's concerned about where in the environment it's going to run, and it's obsessed about how much time it has to get there. Well, when you and I live by those chemicals of survival, we become materialists. We become over-focused on our bodies. We obsess about body parts, what we look like, things we own in our environment, the people we know. We obsess about time. And those chemicals of stress are highly addictive. They cause a rush of energy in the body that wakes the brain and the body up to become heightened and aware for a very short period of time. So what happens is we begin to become addicted to these emotions so that we can feel some rush of energy in order to feel alive. And that rush of chemistry endorses the ego for us to over-focus on ourselves. And we begin to unconsciously use the circumstances, the conditions, the people in our life to reaffirm our addiction so that we can remember who we are as a somebody. Those chemicals create the emotions that we just talked about, from aggression to fear to guilt to shame to insecurity to unworthiness. Those are, according to the psychological model, 90% of how people think and act and feel are negative, and it's driven by those emotions. So, when we live in a sense by these survival emotions that are highly addictive, an interesting thing happens. The brain changes to the extent that we start functioning in beta wave patterns. And beta waves are your thinking brain. And when your beta waves get too high, you're overanalyzing. And in beta, the external world becomes more real than the internal world. In beta, you're a materialist defining reality by your senses, and you're trying to predict the next experience in order for you to survive in that circumstance. The unknown has no room to show up in your life when you're in that state. When you're in that state of creation that we talked about earlier with the frontal lobe, and you forget about yourself, and that forebrain begins to control the hindbrain, or your frontal lobe is cooling off the emotional centers and the rest of the automatic programs in the brain. Once the hardwired circuits in the chemistry are cooled off, and the thought becomes the experience, we could say that in the moment of creation, you forget about yourself. You forget about your identity. You become nobody. You become no thing. You become no time. And the moment you lose your associations to the environment, the body, and time, not only do nerve cells no longer fire together, no longer wire together, your old identity is beginning to become dismantled. But the survival centers that have been running in the lower part of the body, the adrenal centers and the sexual glands and all that stuff that has defined you because of how you think and feel, the moment the identity is off the throne, that energy in the body has to go somewhere, and it begins to move right to your heart. It begins to move right into that area, and you begin to fall in love with what you're creating. Now, this isn't a metaphysical concept. This is a physiological concept, because the moment you're no longer thinking and feeling as that same state of being or that same personality, and the identity is literally gone, you are nobody, no thing, no time, that emotional energy, remember, emotions are energy in motion, it literally begins to move to your heart, and you begin to feel expanded. You begin to feel connected to something greater. Whereas when you're living by those survival emotions, you feel separate from the field. You feel separate from something greater, and you're using your senses to try to always control an outcome. When you move into this wonderful moment where energy begins to change and it's liberated as out of the body, and you're feeling this elevated emotion, you're reconditioning your body to a new mind and a new emotion, and your body is no longer living in the past, but in fact it's beginning to pull the anchor out of the past and see a whole new horizon in the future. And that energy then begins to rewrite the programs that once determined who you were. And as that heart begins to open and you begin to feel that experience ahead of the event, you're signaling new genes in new ways. And your body now, as the unconscious mind, is believing that it's in that reality. And when you feel connected and you feel that elevated emotion and the body's free from its addiction because it's no longer believing that it's living in some past emotion unconsciously, the moment that that happens, you trust in the outcome. You no longer need your senses to define reality because you've already experienced it enough times. Now you don't know how it's going to happen or when it's going to happen. All you know is that it's going to happen. Now, the beauty behind all of this, the wonder and joy behind all of this, is that you can't be tickled, according to some of the latest research in tickling. You can't be tickled if you know where you're going to be tickled and when you're going to be tickled. It's impossible because tickling requires a surprise, an unexpected moment. And so think of this field of intelligence that's both personal within you and universal all around you. Everything, according to the quantum model, is made up of energy. As a matter of fact, 99.99999% of an atom is energy or empty nothing space, and 0.00001% of reality is physical substance particles. Isn't it funny we keep all our attention on that 0.00001%? When you move into this state of creation and you're focused on that 99.99999% of nothing, you're no longer a materialist. Now you are in a state where you are connected to something greater, and you allow this intelligence to begin to organize, and you surrender to the effects of it surprising you in one way to wake us up from this dream. And when that new experience creates a new emotion, and the energy that's associated with that new emotion then drives us, inspires us to want to do it again. And in that moment when we are consumed by that experience, we could look back at our entire life and we can see all the mistakes and all the things that we used to regret. And in that moment when something wonderful like this happens, we can look back at our whole entire past and we wouldn't want to change any aspect of it. We wouldn't want to change anything about it. We wouldn't even want to change a hair on a person's head in the present moment, in that moment, because it all led us to this wonderful state of grace. And when that happens, that's when the past begins to change and roll up into the present, and the body now is no longer anchored to the old personality that's connected to old emotions. We are now free to move into a new future.